We have a armada. We have a massive fleet heading in that direction.
Right now, the largest US armada in years is sitting off the Iranian coast. The regime has barely survived the bloodiest month in its history, and there are rumors that the supreme leader has a flight plan to Moscow. Yet, oddly enough, markets are eerily calm. And that's why today we're going to uncover what's really happening on the ground, why the Iranian regime is more fragile than ever, and most importantly, what a collapse would actually mean for oil, global inflation, and your portfolio. My name is Nick, and you're watching Coin Bureau Finance. First up, we need to make one thing absolutely clear. Nothing in this video is financial advice. This is purely educational content designed to give you an objective look into the Iranian regime. And if you want more deep dives like this, then make sure you're subscribed, drop a like, and flick that notification bell so you don't miss the next one. Now, to understand why the Iranian regime is currently staring into the abyss, we need to rewind the clock. You cannot make sense of the chaos of January 2026 without looking at the event that effectively broke the regime's back, the 12-day war in the summer of 2025. For those unfamiliar, Israel launched Operation Rising Lion, a campaign of precision strikes which degraded Iran's military and its leadership. We're talking about the removal of Mohammad Bagheri, the chief of staff, and Hussein Salami, the head of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, or the IRGC. So, the regime lost most of its experienced commanders and, crucially, most of its integrated air defense systems. But the knockout blow came from the United States with Operation Midnight Hammer. In that mission, the US Air Force flew 7 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers on a 37-hour non-stop run from the US heartland to the Persian Gulf. Their target was the deeply buried Fordo nuclear facility, and they were carrying the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator, which, as the name would imply, is a 30,000-pound beast of a bomb. The first bomb punched a hole in the mountain, and the second flew right through it to detonate inside. Yet, the result wasn't Iran's nuclear program being wiped off the face of the earth. It was more of a temporary setback, as reports suggest the mission didn't have nearly as big of an impact as anticipated. So as we sit here in early 2026, the Iranian regime is militarily weak. They have limited air defense to shield them from the US armada sitting off the Iranian coast, and no nuclear bomb card to play to force a negotiation. And with the regime weak, the internal pressures, which have been building for decades, finally had nowhere left to hide. Now this brings us to the core contradiction of modern Iran. On paper, the country should be an economic superpower. It holds the world's third largest oil reserves and second largest natural gas reserves. It sits on the most critical trade route on the planet, and by all rights, it should be a G20 economy. Instead, it is facing water wars, which you can learn more about right over here, rolling blackouts, and a currency that has effectively gone to zero. So, how does a country with that much wealth end up so broke? Well, economists call it a Dutch disease, where a reliance on resource exports kills every other sector in the economy. But in Iran's case, it's not just bad luck, it's structural theft. You see, the IRGC isn't just a military force, it's a business conglomerate. Through holding companies, the Revolutionary Guard Corps controls an estimated 50% of the Iranian economy. They build the dams, they run the telecom networks, and, crucially, they control the oil infrastructure. And this creates a vampire economy where the profits from Iran's resources don't go to the state budget or public services. They are siphoned off into the opaque network of military elite. But you might be wondering, if they're under maximum sanctions, who are they selling to? And this is where the shadow fleet comes in. Iran has built a sophisticated network of tankers that disable their transponders, spoof their locations, and transfer oil ship to ship in waters off of Malaysia. This oil eventually lands in China, specifically with the so-called teapot refiners, small independent refineries that operate outside of the global financial system. As of 2025, these teapots were buying roughly 90% of Iran's oil exports, but The catch is that they buy at a steep discount, often $8 to $10 below the market price. And the result for the average Iranian is, well, today's Iran. In 1979, $1 bought you 70 rials. Today, $1 buys you roughly 1.4 million rials. Official inflation is running at 60%, but food inflation is closer to 90%. Because of this, the country is bleeding its most valuable resource, its people. We are seeing a brain drain of roughly 150 to 180,000 educated Iranians leaving the country every single year, while the return rate is estimated to be less than 1%. So, you have a population that is broke, hungry, and watching their government sell their future to China for a discount. And in the first week of January 2026, the government lit that match themselves. But before we move on, if you want to take more control of your financial future, one simple step is staying informed. And you can do that by signing up for our free weekly newsletter. And while you're down there, you can check out our finance-related deals we've put together exclusively for the viewers of this channel. Just click the link in the description or scan this QR code on the screen. It's completely free, and the deals include exclusive bonuses, discounts, and promotions. And this now brings us to today. With the regime already hollowed out by the vampire economy, the government made a fatal miscalculation. Facing a budget crisis, the president decided to slash the gasoline subsidies that had kept the country running. And when that safety net was cut, the reaction was instantaneous. It started with street sellers in Tehran, people who usually keep their heads down, but within 48 hours, it had spread to 28 of Iran's 31 provinces. And unlike the Mahsa Amini protests of 2022, which were largely social and political, these were purely economic. So this wasn't just students or activists. This was the poor, the middle class, and even the religious conservatives who had historically supported the regime. They weren't chanting about lifestyle choices. They were chanting about survival. And the regime's response was simply brutal. We witnessed what is now being called the Weekend of Blood. In cities like Rasht, security forces reportedly set fire to markets to flush out protesters and then opened fire on them as they rushed to escape the flames. But it wasn't just brute force. The regime also deployed advanced psychological operations. Drones flew outside apartment windows, playing recordings known as, quote, identifiable sounds, the noises of torture and interrogation, to terrify people into staying home. Surveillance cameras were used to track faces in real time. Estimates from opposition groups suggest that the death toll has climbed north of 30,000 people. Now, to put that into perspective, that is roughly 3 times the number of US troops killed in Iran and Afghanistan combined, all in a matter of days. But what fueled the protesters' courage was a belief that they weren't alone. On social media, President Trump posted a message in all caps. Quote, Iranian patriots, keep protesting. Help is on the way. For the people on the streets, this was interpreted as a promise of immediate military intervention. Yet, there weren't even US military assets in the region to support the protest, so help never arrived. Why? Geopolitics is rarely simple, and the calculation in Washington likely shifted. With the US military already distracted by the operation in Venezuela and air defenses in the Middle East still being replenished after the 12-day war, the risk of a regional missile war was deemed too high. And then there was also the trap theory, which was the idea that the regime wanted a US strike so that they could rally the population around the flag. So the US held its fire, the regime unleashed its full fury, and the uprising was crushed. But while the streets are mostly quiet for now, US aerial and naval assets have made it to the region, and as was the case in Venezuela, they probably aren't there just for show. Now, the reality is that the regime knows its days are numbered. For decades, the Islamic Republic portrayed itself as an ideological fortress, a revolutionary state that would stand for thousands of years. But today, the regime is no longer fighting for an idea. It's fighting for survival. According to intelligence reports leaked to the Times earlier this month, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, now 86 years old, has reportedly authorized a Plan B, and this is an escape protocol for him and roughly 20 of his closest aides to flee to Moscow should the security forces collapse. But if the leadership is ready to run, why didn't the US military finish the job when it had a chance? And the answer lies in the regime's insurance policy. While their long-range missiles can't hit Israel or Europe effectively anymore, Iran has taken delivery of Russian Iskander missiles. These tactical ballistic missiles have a range of roughly 500 kilometers. That's not enough to reach Tel Aviv, but it's more than enough to reach the airbase of the US in Qatar, the nerve center of US air operations, and the US's 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. We already saw a preview of this in June 2025 when Iran fired a salvo of missiles in retaliation for the US strikes. They mostly missed then, but a desperate regime firing 100 missiles at once won't miss everything. So the West faces a bit of a dilemma. Strike the regime, and they might burn the regional energy infrastructure down on their way out. Don't strike, and they continue to brutalize their own people. And in the midst of all of this, the cracks in the system are getting wider by the day. A senior Iranian diplomat at the UN in Geneva defected and requested asylum in Switzerland. When your own elites start jumping ship, you know the vessel is taking on water. Furthermore, there is a growing rift between the Artesh, the regular national army, and the IRGC. The Artesh largely sat on the sidelines during the recent crackdowns, refusing to fire on the civilians. The killing has been mostly done exclusively by the IRGC. If that split widens, or the regular army decides to turn its guns on the Revolutionary Guard, then we aren't looking at a protest anymore. We are looking at a civil war. And that brings us to the final and perhaps most critical question of the puzzle. What happens to the world's most important trade route and oil if Iran implodes? On the surface, it looks like madness. We have a major war fleet in the Persian Gulf and a country on the brink of a civil war. In any normal timeline, oil should be trading over $100 a barrel right now. But the market is pricing in a very specific and perhaps very dangerous assumption. The consensus view is that no matter who runs Tehran, whether it's the IRGC or a new democratic government, they will need to sell oil to survive. The market believes that the shadow fleet of tankers will keep chugging along to China, bypassing the conflict entirely. And currently, the world is swimming in oil. Non-OPEC production from the US, Brazil, and Guyana has been hitting record highs, and this has created a buffer that has allowed traders to shrug off geopolitical risk. But here is where the complacency gets dangerous. That buffer depends entirely on one country, Saudi Arabia. Right now, Saudi Arabia is the only nation on earth with a significant spare capacity, the ability to quickly turn on the taps and pump millions of extra barrels if there is a disruption elsewhere. And the market assumes that if Iran goes offline, the Saudis will simply step in and fill the gap. But that assumption ignores a dangerous scenario. If the IRGC feels the walls are closing in, they have one final card to play. And it isn't a nuclear weapon, it's an economic one. They could target the Saudi energy infrastructure. We know they can do that because they've tried it before. Back in 2019, Iranian drones hit a processing facility in Saudi Arabia, temporarily knocking out 50% of the kingdom's oil production. And that was just a warning shot. If those Russian Iskander missiles are used to target the East-West pipeline, the crucial artery that allows Saudi Arabia to bypass the Persian Gulf, then that spare capacity the market is relying on evaporates overnight. And then, of course, there is the Strait of Hormuz. Roughly 20% of the world's total oil supply passes through this very narrow choke point every single day. If the regime decides to mine the strait or sink a few supertankers on their way out the door, it would send oil prices vertical, shattering the fragile fight against inflation that central banks have been waging for the last 5 years. Now, the US knows this, and that is exactly why President Trump has been hesitant to strike the final blow. He knows that while regime change might be good for long-term stability, the short-term oil shock would be catastrophic for the US economy and his approval ratings. The White House has floated the idea of imposing tariffs on Iran's trading partners to squeeze them further, but let's be honest, we have reached the point of diminishing returns. You can't sanction a country that is already locked out of the global financial system, and you can't threaten to cut off trade with a regime that smuggles everything via the black market. So, what next for Iran and its long-suffering people? As we look at the wreckage of the Iranian economy and the warships on the horizon, we are essentially looking at two possible futures. And for investors, the difference between them is everything. Scenario 1 is the collapse model. In this version, the cracks we are seeing widen until the dam breaks. The regime falls, either through a coup or a civil war. In the short term, this is chaotic. We would almost certainly see an oil shock as the outgoing regime tries to burn the house down. But in the long term, a post-theocratic Iran could be the biggest emerging market story of the decade. Imagine a country with the resources of Australia, the population of Turkey, and the geography of Dubai suddenly reopening for business. Millions of barrels of oil would return to the legal market, creating a massive deflationary boom. Meanwhile, the lives and living standards of the Iranian people would see an enormous improvement after decades of repression and hardship. Scenario 2, though, is the North Korea model, which is the darker and, frankly, more likely path. When the regime realizes it has lost the people, it stops trying to win them over. Instead, it relies purely on brutality and external support from Russia and China to stay in power. The lives of ordinary Iranians will get even harder and more precarious. In this scenario, Iran becomes a pariah state on steroids, permanently locked out of the global economy, using its shadow fleet to scrape by and using its missile arsenal to blackmail the region. This creates a permanent risk floor under the oil price, so every time there is a rumor of a missile launch, oil will spike, and the Strait of Hormuz will remain a constant choke point for the global economy. Right now, the market seems to be pricing in scenario 2. It assumes the status quo will limp along. But here is the danger. Markets are terrible at pricing in tail risks, events that have a low probability but a massive impact. If the regime decides to play its final card and target the Saudi pipelines, we could see oil go from $60 to $120 in a matter of weeks. And that is why, despite the calm, the smartest money is still holding hedges, whether that is energy stocks or gold. Because having exposure to real things is the only way to protect yourself when the paper promises start burning. As the saying goes, the only thing more dangerous than a strong regime is a weak one. But we want to hear from you. Do you think the Iranian regime can survive 2026? Or are we watching the final days of the Islamic Republic? Let us know your thoughts down in the comments below. And if you want to know where the US military might need to deploy its military next, be sure to check out our deep dive into the China-Taiwan conflict right over here. As always, thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you again soon. This is Nick, signing off.